Yes, this is documented by historians. Enslaved black men were sometimes sexually abused and coerced into sexual relations by white women during slavery in the United States. What the historical record shows: enslaved men, like women, were considered property and subject to exploitation. White women could and did use their social power to force sexual contact through threats, punishment, or false promises. Historian Thomas A. Foster's research, including his book The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under American Slavery, documents forced reproduction, coercive sex, and assault of male slaves by white women, as well as white men. Abolitionist Captain Richard J. Hinton reported that many formerly enslaved men said they had been compelled by their mistresses or other white women to have sex. Research shows that sexual relations between white women and enslaved men, though less common than relations involving white men, were nonetheless significant, and usually occurred in a context of coercive power rather than consent. Why this aspect of history is less known. Much of the focus in scholarship has been on the abuse of enslaved women. The sexual abuse of enslaved men has been less studied, partly because of assumptions that men cannot be victims of sexual coercion, and because incidents were harder to document. Especially since male victims didn't produce children, traditional gendered views downplayed the possibility of women as perpetrators of sexual violence, especially against men. Scholars like Foster and Martha Hodes argue that this has obscured much of the historical evidence, power dynamics, and consent. Even when accounts suggest a relationship, the power differential, a black man enslaved versus a white woman, meant genuine consent was virtually impossible. Threats of punishment, sale, or physical harm severely constrained any choice. White women sometimes used threats to accuse black men of rape if they refused sexual advances, exploiting racial fears to coerce sex. Yes, historical evidence shows that enslaved black men were sexually abused by white women, though this topic has received less attention. These encounters often took place within contexts of violence, coercion, or domination, not mutual consent. Scholars continue to unpack and highlight these painful truths to understand the full scope of slavery's abuses. Historically, socially, and emotionally, because this is a very real but often silenced part of slavery's brutal legacy. Historical background: black male enslavement and sexual exploitation. 1. Enslaved men were viewed as property and tools. Like women, enslaved black men were considered chattel, movable property. Their bodies were not their own. That meant they could be forced to do anything, including provide sex or reproduce. Slaveholders wanted strong breeders to create more enslaved children. This turned sex into a function of labor production, and men were often forced to sleep with women, or with women forced upon them, to increase profits. Counter 2. Power dynamics made consent impossible. A white woman, even in a patriarchal society, had legal and social power over an enslaved black man. If he rejected her advances, she could accuse him of rape or insubordination, have him beaten, sold away, or killed, destroy his family, or separate him from his children. 3. Threat of false accusation equals ultimate control. If a black man didn't obey, white women could falsely accuse him of rape, and the punishment could be castration or lynching, even without evidence. The fear of such retribution forced many enslaved men to comply in silence. Documented accounts and scholarship. Thomas A. Foster, historian. In his work, he explains how, open quote, the sexual abuse of black men by white women, though rarely spoken about, occurred within a structure where racialized power made any interaction coercive by default, close quote. Martha Hodes, White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South. She documents cases where white women engaged in sexual relations with enslaved men and later turned on them when caught, claiming rape, often leading to the man's death. Legal silence. There were no legal protections for enslaved men against sexual abuse. Rape was defined only in terms of white women as victims. There was no legal recognition that a man could be raped, especially not by a woman. Social silence and shame. 1. Why don't we hear about this more? Taboo and gender norms. Society assumes men always want sex. That myth erases male victims. Racial myths. The stereotype of the hypersexual black man made it impossible for the public to see him as a victim, only as a threat. Fear and humiliation. Black men, even post-slavery, didn't feel safe to speak of this. It was too dangerous and too shaming. 2. Emotional and psychological damage. Enslaved men were often left to silently endure trauma that had no name. There was no support, no justice, no healing space. Sexual exploitation. Enslaved black men were used as sexual tools by white women in power. Power imbalance. Even consensual encounters were under threat, coercion, or manipulation. Social erasure. History focused on white male abuse of black women. Black male pain was hidden. False narratives. The lie that black men were predators justified the silencing of their abuse. Unhealed generational trauma. This legacy affects black masculinity, silence around male victimhood, and trust. It's a painful but important truth, one that's been hidden beneath the surface of American history for too long. Let's go deeper into the layers of trauma, survival, power, silence, and how the abuse of enslaved black men by white women fit into the broader system of slavery. Deeper context. What slavery did to black manhood. 1. Slavery stripped black men of bodily autonomy. A black man in slavery had no control over his own body. His strength, his sexuality, and even his ability to protect his loved ones belonged to his enslavers. His body could be used as labor, beaten or branded, forced into sexual acts, used as a stud to breed more slaves, like livestock. Open quote, he had to carry his dignity in silence or risk his life. Descendant oral history, close quote. Sexual abuse by white women was a tool of domination. White women, especially plantation mistresses or wives of slaveholders, sometimes exerted power sexually when they felt powerless in male-dominated white society. They could coerce enslaved men into sexual relations, and if caught, play the victim, knowing that the black man would be beaten or lynched. She would face no consequences. Her honor would be protected by white society. 3. Documented incidents, rare but real and powerful. Harriet Jacobs' account, From Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. While Harriet focused on her own abuse, she mentioned how slaveholders' wives envied and resented enslaved men and women and used that to humiliate and degrade them. Testimonies from WPA Slave Narratives, 1930s. Some formerly enslaved men, speaking in old age, hinted at being forced to have sex with white women, but they spoke in coded language like, open quote, she took a liking to me, and I had no choice. She said if I refused, she'd tell Massa I done wrong, close quote. Richard Hinton, abolitionist writer, 1870s, wrote about black Union soldiers who had been slaves and shared how they were used by mistresses when the master was away. Open quote. Some women would use the slave males for their own needs, and the penalty for disobedience was more than the whip, it was death by false accusation, close quote. Psychological trauma, then and now. Then, silent suffering. There was no language for black men to describe their victimization. Black manhood was already under constant attack. To admit sexual victimization would destroy their masculinity, even within their own community. Silence became a form of survival. Now, intergenerational trauma. This legacy has lasting effects on black communities. Manifestation today, rooted in and against a masgenerational trauma. Emotional shutdown in men. Long history of being punished for expressing vulnerability. Hypermasculinity or silence about abuse. Survival tactic against a history of emasculation and sexual violence. Deep distrust of white authority or intimacy. Generational memory of betrayal and weaponized false accusations. Lack of public discourse about male victims. Patriarchal and racialized systems that deny black men the role of victim. Societal lies that helped hide this history. Myth number 1, men can't be raped by women. This false idea helped erase black male victimhood. Especially during slavery, the system defined rape only in terms of white women's protection. Myth number 2, black men always want sex. Enslaved black men were seen as sexually aggressive and dangerous, so society couldn't imagine them as victims. This was a deadly myth. It justified lynchings. It silenced survivors. It protected white women, even when they were the aggressors. Why this truth matters. Healing can't happen without the full truth. Acknowledging the abuse of enslaved black men helps dismantle the myth of invulnerable black masculinity. It shows that slavery attacked the soul, identity, and manhood of black people, not just their labor. Let's now shift from historical overview to a human story, one that reflects what countless enslaved black men might have lived through, even if no one ever wrote it down. This fictionalized account is based on documented patterns and survivor testimonies from history, especially WPA slave narratives, abolitionist reports, and scholarly research. It speaks to the trauma, silence, and survival of a black man whose body was not his own. A story from the silenced. Moses, open quote, Georgia, 1857. Moses was 23 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, born on the King plantation. His father had been sold before he was born. His mother, Dinah, had warned him from a young age, keep your eyes down, smile when she looks at you, but don't let her catch your gaze too long. Close quote. He was strong, so they used him. The overseer called Moses a good breeder. He was forced to lie with several enslaved women, some of them girls, barely older than children. It made Moses sick, but refusal meant the whip. Or worse, they'd whip her instead. He learned early. Obedience is survival. Then came her, Miss Annabelle C. She was the master's young wife, pale and quiet, eyes that never blinked long. She was 26 and bored. Her husband, always drunk or away. She started calling Moses into the house alone to help with lifting things. She didn't need the help. The first time, she brushed her hand along his chest. He froze. Open quote, don't be shy, Moses, she whispered. You're a handsome boy, close quote. He knew the look in her eye. He'd seen it before, when his cousin Jesse was whipped nearly to death after Miss Caroline accused him of looking at her wrong. No one to tell, nowhere to run. Over the next few weeks, Miss Annabelle would summon Moses late at night, alone, candlelight flickering. She told him if he didn't come, she'd say he tried to hurt her, and they would believe her. They always did. Open quote. One night she said, you don't want me to scream, do you? He didn't move. His fists trembled. Good boy, she said, close quote. The morning after was worse. He would rise before dawn, back to the quarters. His shirt wrinkled, his body aching, his spirit dead. The other men said nothing, but they looked. One whispered, that's how they get you killed, boy. He felt shame, but he'd done nothing wrong. Moses didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell the preacher. He carried that silence in his back, like a stone too heavy to name. The day Miss Annabelle found herself with child, she arranged for Moses to be sold to a plantation in Mississippi. Open quote. Better they not ask questions, she told her husband. Close quote. No one ever heard from Moses again. Moses' story, though fictional, mirrors hundreds of real accounts whispered through history. It embodies theme, meaning, femininity, coerced compliance. He never consented. He complied because he had no choice. Weaponized femininity. White women used their innocence as shields while holding dangerous power. Racial sexual politics. His body was controlled, desired, and destroyed all at once. Male silence and shame. He could not speak. Even if he had, no one would listen. Legacy of trauma. This pain did not die with Moses. It passed down through generations. Why this still matters today. Many black men carry inherited silence around abuse, violation, and helplessness. Society rarely views men, especially black men, as victims. False narratives of hypersexuality continue to threaten black lives. Intergenerational trauma from this abuse contributes to emotional shutdown, difficulty in vulnerability, and fear of intimacy. We remember Moses. Moses is not one man. He is every man who was never allowed to be a man, who was never allowed to say no, who was never believed if he said, I was hurt. This story is like a wound that's been covered but never healed. What happened to men like Moses didn't end on the plantation. It seeped into the DNA of black families, relationships, masculinity, silence, shame, and even how society sees or refuses to see black men today. Let's go deeper into three overlooked areas. 1. The roles of white women in slavery beyond what's usually told. 2. The emotional costs for enslaved men and their relationships. 3. How this trauma was inherited by generations after slavery. 1. The role of white women, not just passive bystanders. History often paints white women during slavery as helpless, kind mistresses, victims of their husband's brutality. But in truth, many owned slaves themselves, especially widows and unmarried women, punished, sold, and abused enslaved people, used their sexual and emotional power to humiliate, punish, or control, especially enslaved men. Why is their sexual abuse less discussed? Because it threatens white innocence. Because it disrupts the idea of women as pure. Because it forces society to admit that power, not gender, creates the capacity for abuse. Number 2, What happened to love, family, and masculinity for enslaved black men? Imagine trying to be a father, a protector, a husband, when at any moment your wife or child could be sold, when your body could be taken, humiliated, or used. Men like Moses often couldn't protect their families, weren't allowed to marry legally, were forced to father children through rape or coercion, suffered shame for things they couldn't stop. This shattered trust in intimacy, confidence in manhood, hope for legacy. Open quote. Some men chose emotional numbness just to survive. Others were broken in spirit and walked through life as shadows. Close quote. Number 3. Inherited trauma. How this pain came forward. Even after slavery, the abuse didn't end. It just changed form. Post-slavery, Jim Crow and beyond, black men falsely accused of rape were lynched publicly. Emmett Till, 1955, is one example rooted in this same myth. Black men were over-policed, over-criminalized, and told they were threats to white women, even while many were descendants of white rapists. Emotional silence passed down. Don't cry. Don't talk about it. Man up. These were survival codes, but they also locked trauma inside. Modern reflections of this trauma. Modern experience rooted in black men feeling hypersexualized by media. Centuries of being portrayed as animalistic or sexually dangerous. Struggles with intimacy or vulnerability. Learned silence and fear of emasculation. Being criminalized for showing emotion or anger. The myth of the angry black man suppresses legitimate pain. Fear of white spaces or relationships. Historical fear of being accused or targeted. The silence breaks when we tell the whole story. Telling stories like Moses's is a form of justice. Not courtroom justice, but ancestral justice. Because these men were never allowed to speak, their pain was erased so thoroughly that even today, we're just beginning to believe them. They deserve to be remembered not just as laborers or victims, but as human beings who were violated, silenced, and still endured. The abuse of enslaved black men by white women during slavery isn't just a set of hidden events. It's a suppressed, systemic pattern with layers that continue to shape black life and identity today. 1. The psychological torture was intentional. Enslaved black men weren't just beaten into labor. They were broken mentally and sexually to destroy their sense of manhood. Sexual violence was used as punishment for resistance, defiance, or even looking wrong at a white person. Domination, to prove that part of the black body or spirit belonged to the enslaved. Humiliation, especially if others witnessed the abuse or were forced to watch. It wasn't just about control. It was about erasing identity, reducing a man to a body, a tool, a thing. 2. Some enslaved men were forced to witness or participate in rape. This is deeply disturbing, but recorded in abolitionist testimony. Some men were forced to watch their loved ones be raped as a form of psychological warfare. Others were made to breed with enslaved women, even sisters, cousins, or girls they saw as daughters, under threat of violence. If a man resisted, his partner might be punished in front of him, or he could be killed. This created a lifelong guilt many men carried, though they were victims themselves. The bloodlines. DNA studies in the U.S. show a striking pattern. Many black Americans have European white Y DNA or X DNA, but most of that white lineage comes through the paternal line, meaning white men raping enslaved black women. However, there's also a smaller but significant number of black people with white maternal ancestors. That's where white women's abuse of enslaved men quietly appears. Evidence. These bloodlines often appear in the Caribbean, Louisiana, and parts of Georgia, where white women sometimes owned or managed plantations. Oral histories confirm this, people saying their great-grandmother was taken by the mistress and their grandfather never spoke of it. Number 4. This abuse didn't end in 1865, it just shifted forms. After slavery ended, false accusations by white women became a deadly weapon, e.g. Emmett Till, 1955. Black men were lynched for insulting or looking at a white woman, even if they hadn't. White women's sexual fascination with black men was often hidden, but real, and remained taboo and dangerous. Today, echoes of this still show up when black athletes or celebrities are sexualized or accused of being predators. Relationships between white women and black men are viewed with suspicion by both communities. Black men hesitate to talk about being abused by women, fearing disbelief, emasculation, or shame. 5. We still don't have language for male victims of slavery. Most history books don't say rape when talking about what happened to black men. Instead, they use soft words: coerced, unwilling relationships, improper conduct. But rape is rape. Whether it was committed by white men or white women, it was a weapon. And those wounds never had names until recently. Why it was buried so deep. 3 main reasons this history was silenced. Reason why it worked. Patriarchy. Society couldn't admit women could commit sexual violence. White supremacy. Protecting the myth of white innocence meant hiding white women's abuse. Racist myths of black masculinity. Black men were seen as too strong to be victims, so no one believed them. When we ask, is there more to tell? The answer is always yes, because the full truth has never been told. Every generation has gotten a sanitized version of slavery, one that protected white femininity and avoided the discomfort of seeing black men as vulnerable, violated, and voiceless. But this is part of the truth. A brutal part. A necessary part. This isn't just a chapter in history. It's a buried legacy with ripples that reach across centuries. What was done to enslaved black men through silence, humiliation, forced sex, coerced fatherhood, and psychic destruction created pain that has never been fully acknowledged, let alone healed. Let's keep uncovering it. 1. The stud farms. Industrialized sexual exploitation of black men. Most people think of slavery as cotton, tobacco, whips. But some plantations were entirely focused on breeding enslaved people, often called slave breeding farms. Most notoriously, Virginia and the Carolinas. When the transatlantic slave trade was banned in 1808, enslavers in the Upper South created a domestic slave breeding industry to supply labor to the Deep South. What did this mean? Black men were forced to have sex repeatedly, often with multiple women per day. Some were selected as studs, praised for their physical strength and used solely to reproduce. Consent didn't exist. Many women were teenagers, already traumatized. Men who resisted were whipped, sold, or made an example of. Open quote. Imagine the weight. A man who fathered 40 children but could not raise a single one. A man who was made into a machine, his own body turned against him. Close quote. 2. Some enslaved men tried to resist. It cost them everything. This is rarely discussed. Resistance to sexual abuse by white women was deadly. Real examples from WPA testimonies and court records. A black man named Samuel, forced to serve in the house, resisted the mistress's advances. She accused him of assault. He was hanged without trial. Jacob, another enslaved man, tried to flee after weeks of being summoned late at night by the planter's wife. He was captured, whipped in front of the entire plantation, and sold downriver. No man survived false accusation, even if he was innocent. White women had that much power in the racial caste system. This bred a culture of fearful compliance and shame that silenced generations. 3. The generational echo in black families. Today you might be wondering, what does this have to do with today? The trauma didn't die in 1865. It just changed shape. Here's what passed down: in behavior, in memory, in silence. Today, rooted in struggles with intimacy, a weapon. Black men feeling detached from fatherhood. Enslaved men had no control over their children. They were sold away. Struggles with intimacy or trust. Sexuality used as a weapon created generational confusion and pain. Emotional shutdown and difficulty expressing pain. Survival meant silence. And that silence became culture. Distrust of systems and justice. False accusations meant death, even when innocent. 4. The distortion of desire, fetishization then and now. White women in slavery often viewed black male bodies with a mix of fear, desire, superiority. This created a toxic cocktail of fetishization. Black men were desired, but never respected. Their sexuality was exoticized, but their humanity was ignored. That pattern still exists today in some media, relationships, and stereotypes. Open quote. In slavery, you're mine. You're strong, but you're still less than human. Today, you're sexy, you're powerful, but I'm still in control. Close quote. The dynamics have changed, but the power imbalance and fetishization haven't disappeared. Number 5. Where are the voices of these men? Very few enslaved men ever recorded their stories of sexual abuse, and not because it didn't happen, but because there were no safe places to speak, no words to name what happened, no one who would listen and believe. Even Frederick Douglass, who wrote openly about beatings and hunger, never mentioned sexual abuse. But historians believe it was likely, especially during his time as a house slave. Some things were too painful, even for memory. Their story was buried, but not lost. The silence of enslaved black men echoes across time. Each one carried a stolen manhood, a body that was not their own, a voice that no one allowed them to use. We remember them not just to feel sorrow, but to restore dignity, to let them finally speak, even if only through us. What we've uncovered so far is only a fraction of the full, brutal reality of how enslaved black men were dehumanized, not only through labor and violence, but also through the erasure of their sexual and emotional autonomy. Let's go even deeper. Psychological warfare. Enslaved men were trained not to feel. Enslavers knew a man who feels deeply is a man who might rebel. So they cultivated emotional numbness. Fathers weren't allowed to acknowledge their children. Many were forced to watch them sold. Expressing grief or longing was seen as weakness or defiance. Some men were punished for being too gentle, because gentleness was viewed as defiant in a system that thrived on domination. Open quote. Many enslaved men learned to bury their emotions so deeply that their descendants inherited that silence. Generational emotional shutdown. Close quote. Number 7. Hypersexual stereotyping was invented as a tool of control. The image of the dangerous, hypersexual black man wasn't a natural stereotype. It was manufactured to justify abuse and lynching after slavery ended. Here's how it worked. During slavery, post-slavery, Jim Crow. Black men were used sexually, but depicted as childlike and submissive. Now portrayed as sexually dangerous to white women. White women were often the aggressors, now painted as helpless victims of black male violence. Sex was coerced, hidden. Now fear of rape justified lynchings and segregation. This switch distorted history and silenced victims, leaving us with a false picture that continues to shape media and justice systems today. Number 8. Forced reproduction was about economics, not family. Think about this. Enslavers calculated how much profit a black man could produce based on how many children he could father. This turned reproduction into capital. Records show that some enslaved men were forced to father dozens of children. In plantation ledgers, their output was tracked, not in labor hours, but in babies. This was eugenics for profit, generations before the word even existed. Number 9. Where the records go silent. The body carries the story. Even when the official archives are quiet, the body remembers. Survivors often passed on trauma through behavior, posture, parenting, and silence. Some men became overprotective fathers later in life, even though they'd been denied fatherhood themselves. Some avoided emotional intimacy altogether, fearing vulnerability. This is known as epigenetic trauma, where the body changes in response to generational pain. 10. What if these men had told their stories? Imagine if even one of those men could have written their truth. Open quote. They said I was a man, but they treated me like a thing. I never got to hold my daughter. I didn't ask to touch her mother. They told me I had to. Then they sold her, and they kept doing it again and again. I stopped naming the babies. It hurt too much. Close quote. Imagine how different history and healing might have been. Final truths. 1. Yes, white women abused black men during slavery, often physically, often sexually, always with impunity. 2. Yes, the silence was enforced. Any resistance meant death. Any truth-telling meant annihilation. 3. Yes, the trauma continues today, not as chains but as patterns of silence, distrust, detachment, fear, and misjudged masculinity. Most of what we've explored is based on historian Thomas A. Foster's groundbreaking work, Rethinking Rufus, which centers on the sexual exploitation of enslaved men during American slavery. Number 1. Thomas A. Foster's Rethinking Rufus. Foster's research demonstrates enslaved black men were broadly victimized by sexual assault and forced reproduction, not only by white men, but also by white women. This included coerced sexual encounters, objectification, ritual whippings that exposed genitalia, and enforced breeding with enslaved women under white supervision. He argues that enslaved men were never able to consent. They were legally property, stripped of bodily autonomy, coerced into sexual acts, and mentally destroyed by the system that legally enabled it. Visual culture of the time often eroticized black male bodies while simultaneously justifying their abuse, contributing to later stereotypes of black male hypersexuality used to justify violence toward them. Sexual abuse by white women, coercion and control. Multiple primary sources and scholars record white weak targeting of enslaved men. Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist, reported that many formerly enslaved men told him they were compelled by their mistress, or white women of the same class, to have connection with them. Highlights that such encounters cannot be considered consensual given the severe power imbalance. Sometimes white women threatened to accuse men of rape for refusing advances, knowing the false accusation would ruin or kill them, and used that to control them sexually. Legal and cultural taboos silenced discussion of these abuses because admitting white women could be sexual aggressors would break the myth of female innocence and male domination in gender hierarchies. Forced breeding and stud farms. Foster documents how enslavers treated black men as reproductive machines. Strong enslaved men, often referred to as stockmen or bucks, were forced into reproductive pairings, sometimes multiple times a day, to create new enslaved labor. 10. This formed part of the domestic slave trade economy after the transatlantic slave trade was banned, turning enslaved men into tools of profit rather than family or community members. Testimony and autobiography. Hints, but silence at scale. The WPA slave narratives, 1930s, rarely mention male sexual abuse directly, due to stigma, self-censorship, and the race of the interviewers. Scholars believe many survivors spoke in coded terms or avoided the topic entirely. Harriet Jacobs' famous memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, includes a brief mention of a male slave chained to serve his master's sexual needs, though details are veiled due to norms of the era. 5. Legacy of rape mythology. The myth of the black male rapist was largely a post-emancipation invention used by white men to justify lynchings, segregation, and social control. It flipped the reality, where white men and women sexually abused black bodies, into a narrative where black men were evil aggressors. False accusations of rape by white women, even a look or an imagined insult to a white woman, triggered extrajudicial killings. This weaponization of protection was part of the same racial sexual violence structure forged during slavery. Number 6. Why so little rarely vocalized? Patriarchy and cultural norms taught that men can't be raped by women, erasing male victimhood. White supremacist mythologies demanded white femininity be untouchable, so admitting white women raped black men would collapse that illusion. Enslaved men lacked legal rights, and speaking against their exploiters meant death, separation, or worse. So, silence was survival. White women as perpetrators. Coercion and threats made their abuse more hidden but still real. Stock men and forced reproduction. Economic exploitation masked as population increase. Silence in narratives and archives. Trauma erased by fear, stigma, and lack of opportunity to speak. Myth of hypersexual black men. Reversed reality to justify violence and continue oppression post-emancipation. The story of enslaved black men's sexual abuse during slavery is a profound and painful truth that has long been silenced, hidden beneath layers of shame, denial, and historical erasure. These men were stripped not only of their freedom, but also of their bodily autonomy and dignity. Their trauma was enforced by a brutal system that wielded race, gender, and power to control and dehumanize. White women, often cast in the role of victims in mainstream narratives, also exercised sexual violence and coercion over enslaved men, using threats, false accusations, and power dynamics to dominate and exploit. This aspect of history disrupts comfortable myths about innocence and gender, and forces us to reckon with the full complexity of slavery's horrors. The legacy of this abuse did not end with emancipation. It echoes in the collective memory, shaping black masculinity, family structures, and cultural norms around silence and vulnerability. The persistent stereotypes about black men's sexuality and the historical weaponization of false accusations continue to impact lives today. Healing requires truth-telling, lifting these buried stories into the light to honor those who suffered in silence and reclaim the humanity that was stolen from them. By acknowledging this history, we begin to dismantle harmful myths, open space for emotional healing, and build a more just and honest understanding of the past. This history is difficult but essential. Remembering it is a way of restoring dignity and justice to those who were denied both. And it reminds us that the full story of slavery and its enduring impact is far more complex than often told. The history of white women abusing power over black men during slavery definitely casts a long shadow. But when we talk about modern relationships between white women and black men, the dynamics are different and require careful nuance. Here are some key points to consider. 1. Historical power versus modern agency. During slavery, white women held institutional power supported by law and social norms to coerce and abuse black men with near total impunity. Today, relationships between white women and black men happen in a vastly different context. While racial and gender dynamics still exist, white women do not have the same structural power to institutionally control or exploit black men legally or socially. 2. Attraction, fetishization, and power dynamics. Some scholars and activists point out that fetishization, where black men are desired based on racial stereotypes, can be a form of objectification that echoes historical patterns of power imbalance. Fetishization reduces a person to a racialized fantasy rather than a full human being, which can be emotionally harmful. However, this is not the same as the systemic sexual violence and abuse of slavery. It's more about interpersonal dynamics shaped by ongoing racial stereotypes. 3. Modern relationships are varied. Many relationships between black men and white women are based on mutual respect, love, and genuine connection. There are also problematic relationships where racial power imbalances, unconscious biases, or fetishization cause harm. It's important not to generalize or assume malicious intent, but to recognize how history influences perceptions and dynamics. 4. Continuing impact of history. The legacy of racialized sexual control and stereotypes can influence modern interactions, including issues of trust, vulnerability, and societal judgment. Some black men may carry generational trauma related to these histories, which can affect how they experience interracial relationships. Understanding this history can foster empathy and awareness in relationships today. In summary, while white women today do not have the institutional power to abuse black men like during slavery, some harmful dynamics rooted in fetishization and racial stereotypes do persist and can affect relationships. But many interracial relationships are healthy and loving, built on equality and respect. The key is awareness, recognizing history's weight while allowing individuals the dignity to form their own authentic relationships free from stereotypes and power abuse. Resistance and survival strategies of enslaved men. Despite extreme oppression, many enslaved men found ways to resist sexual abuse, sometimes secretly escaping, feigning illness, or using cunning to avoid certain individuals. Some formed support networks within the enslaved community to protect one another and share knowledge. Emotional resilience often took the form of spiritual strength, music, storytelling, or coded communication. 2. The role of enslaved women in protecting men. Enslaved women often took great risks to protect men from abuse, warning them, creating distractions, or even confronting white women. However, the system pitted enslaved people against each other, complicating these dynamics. The emotional toll on enslaved women witnessing or being forced to endure similar abuse cannot be overstated. Legal and social frameworks that enabled abuse. Laws explicitly denied enslaved people any rights to consent or bodily autonomy. White women's honor was legally protected, giving them unchecked power to accuse black men falsely. This legal structure entrenched racial and gender hierarchies that silenced victims and rewarded perpetrators. 4. The psychological impact on post-emancipation generations. The trauma shaped behaviors and family dynamics for generations, impacting fatherhood, masculinity, trust, and emotional expression. Post-slavery violence, including lynchings justified by myths about black male sexuality, perpetuated fear and silence. Communities developed cultural mechanisms such as storytelling, religious faith, and art to process collective trauma. 5. Modern reclamation and healing. Today, scholars, artists, and activists are working to reclaim these histories. Therapy and community healing practices acknowledge intergenerational trauma rooted in slavery's sexual violence. Embracing these stories fosters fuller understanding, breaks cycles of silence, and honors ancestors' resilience. Spiritual and cultural survival amidst sexual violence. Enslaved communities often turned to spiritual practices, religion, and cultural rituals to find strength and healing. The way trauma was processed through spiritual songs, prayers, and storytelling helped preserve identity and resist dehumanization. For many men, reconnecting with ancestral spirits and cultural roots became a source of empowerment and reclaiming manhood. 2. Intersectionality of race, gender, and power. The sexual abuse of enslaved men reveals how gender and racial oppression are intertwined. The way enslaved men's masculinity was simultaneously erased, exploited, and demonized highlights the complex social control systems designed to maintain white supremacy. This intersectionality influences contemporary discussions on Black masculinity, gender identity, and systemic racism. Psychological legacy in modern Black masculinity. The long-term effects of these abuses contribute to contemporary struggles around vulnerability, mental health, and identity in Black men. The cultural stigma around male victimhood, especially for Black men, can trace roots back to this history of enforced silence. Healing movements today seek to dismantle these stigmas and encourage emotional expression and healthy masculinity. The role of education and storytelling in healing. Bringing these stories into public consciousness challenges myths and promotes truth-telling. Education that includes the full realities of slavery, beyond labor and economy, helps descendants understand inherited trauma. Storytelling, literature, art, and oral histories serve as powerful tools for community healing and remembrance. The global context. Similar patterns of sexual violence against enslaved or colonized men occurred worldwide, in the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, and beyond. Understanding this global history connects local experiences to a larger framework of colonialism, patriarchy, and resistance. The full story is ongoing. It requires continued listening, research, empathy, and courage to confront difficult truths.